The whistle was still between his teeth when he saw her walking across the field. And for one full second, Brandon Carter forgot how to breathe. She had her sunglasses pushed up into her hair, a paper coffee cup in one hand, and a folding chair tucked under the other arm, and she was smiling the easy, distracted smile of a parent arriving late to a Saturday morning practice. Behind her, 10-year-old Madison Collins was already jogging toward the other girls, cleats clicking against the gravel path, ponytail swinging. Brandon had coached this girl for 4 weeks. He had learned her favorite drill, the exact way she liked her shin guards taped, the fact that she chewed on her jersey collar when she was nervous before a corner kick. He had not, until this exact moment, connected her last name to anything. Rachel Collins stopped a few feet from him, tilted her head, and studied his face the way a person studies a word they almost remember. Then something shifted behind her eyes, a small, private collapse of disbelief into certainty, and the smile she gave him next was not the easy parent smile from a moment ago. It was quieter, careful, aimed. "You don't remember me, right?" she said. The clipboard slipped out of his hand. It hit the grass at an angle and skidded, scattering the lineup sheets he'd spent the night before writing out in careful blue ink, and for a moment neither of them moved to pick it up. Behind them, 20 children kept running drills in the mild autumn sun, entirely unaware that the 2 adults standing at the edge of the field had once shared a 14th floor office, a $50 million contract, and a single afternoon that had taken his name off of every blueprint he'd ever signed. To find out how a youth soccer team, a folding chair, and a woman he never expected to see again would end up unraveling 5 years of silence, stay until the very end. If stories like this speak to you, the quiet ones nobody claps for, until the very last scene, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. So many of you watching have lived some version of this. The feeling of being looked straight through by someone who used to know exactly who you were, and it helps to know we're not the only ones who remember. There's an old argument that never quite dies down in comment sections like this one, and it's worth naming early. Whether the people who build a company with their hands and their expertise are the ones a company remembers, or whether it's always the person who happens to be standing closest to the credit when the applause starts. Keep that question in your back pocket. It's going to matter later. 5 years earlier, none of this existed. Not the soccer field, not the coaching whistle, not the quiet apartment above a hardware store where Brandon Carter now lived with his daughter Chloe. 5 years earlier, Brandon Carter's name was still stamped on the load calculations of 6 regional projects for Halbrook Structural Group, a mid-sized engineering firm that had spent 2 decades building its reputation on parking structures, transit platforms, and mixed-use developments across the Northeast Corridor. He was 34 years old, the youngest lead structural engineer the firm had ever promoted, and he was, by every internal metric the company tracked, the best pure calculator of load-bearing risk that Halbrook had on payroll. He was quiet about it. That was simply how he was built. He didn't attend the Friday drinks where the junior partners angled for FaceTime, didn't linger in doorways to be seen agreeing with senior leadership, didn't correct people in meetings so much as he waited, took notes, and fixed the actual numbers afterward in a follow-up email that nobody but the project manager ever read carefully. His colleagues respected him in the distant way people respect a tool that has never once failed them. Nobody thought to wonder what he did on weekends, or why he left promptly at 5:30 every day, without exception, rain or deadline. If they had asked, they would have learned that a woman named Laura Carter had died 2 years earlier, and that the 5:30 exception existed because a 6-year-old girl named Chloe needed picking up from daycare by 6, and there was no one else on the planet whose job that was but his. Rachel Collins, at the time, was Vice President of Operations, 38 years old, and already the subject of hallway speculation about who Halbrook's next CEO would be. She had been brought in 4 years earlier from a much larger firm, hired specifically to modernize a company that still ran half its scheduling on paper, and she had done exactly that, ruthlessly and well. She was not, by nature, a cruel person. She was a pressured one. Halbrook's board had just signed the largest contract in company history, a $41 million mixed-use development downtown, anchored by a 6-level parking structure that would need to support both public traffic and, eventually, a rooftop restaurant the client had insisted on late in the design phase. Rachel had personally guaranteed the board that the revised structural plans, reworked twice under an accelerated timeline, would hold. The man responsible for confirming that they would hold was Brandon Carter, the man standing beside her in nearly every one of those confirmation meetings, nodding along, adding small confident asides about timeline and materials sourcing, was a senior structural consultant named Colin Ashworth. Colin was 41, silver at the temples in a way that photographed well, and possessed of the specific, dangerous charm of someone who had learned that confidence reads as competence to people too busy to check. He had joined Halbrook 2 years after Brandon, climbed faster, and had developed, in the quiet way ambitious men do, a genuine resentment toward the fact that it was Brandon's calculations, not his own polished presentations, that the numbers people always trusted first. Colin had made one decision, 6 weeks before the incident that would end Brandon's career, that he told no one about. Facing a materials shortfall and a client-imposed deadline, he had approved a substitution in the rebar specification for 2 support columns on the lower level, a substitution Brandon had flagged, in writing, as insufficient for the revised load the rooftop restaurant would add. Colin had told Rachel the flag had been resolved. It had not been. The email chain that would have proven otherwise sat, unread by anyone who mattered, in an archived project folder on a server. Nobody thought to search for another 4 years and 11 months. 8 months would pass before that quiet, unresolved warning finally cracked open in front of the entire company, in the worst possible way, on the worst possible morning. The morning it happened. Brandon was on site by 6:30, the way he always was before a client walkthrough, running his own private check of the lower-level support columns with a flashlight and a level, a habit none of his colleagues shared, and none of them mocked, because it had never once produced anything but a clean report. This time, it didn't. He found a hairline stress fracture along the base of column 14, a fracture that, cross-referenced against the load specs he still had memorized cold, told him instantly that the substituted rebar 6 weeks earlier had never been corrected. He called it in immediately. He evacuated the lower level himself, physically walking the 2 maintenance workers off the structure before the safety team even arrived, and he stood in the parking structure's unfinished stairwell for 40 minutes making calls, while above him, 70 feet away, Rachel Collins was walking the client delegation through the top-floor unit that would become the rooftop restaurant, describing the view. By the time the structure was fully cleared and the client delegation stood outside on the sidewalk in stunned silence, a $41 million contract was visibly, publicly wobbling, and somebody needed an answer within the hour. Colin gave them one first. He stood in the boardroom that afternoon with a printed copy of Brandon's original rebar flag from 6 weeks earlier, the same flag Colin had told Rachel was resolved, and reframed it, calmly and without raising his voice, as proof that Brandon had known about a defect and sat on it. He used careful corporate language. He said things like a documented awareness that was never escalated through proper channels, and a communication breakdown that unfortunately falls within Brandon's area of ownership. And every sentence he spoke put another half-inch of distance between himself and the decision he alone had made. Rachel, exhausted, furious, and staring down the possible loss of the biggest contract of her career, did not have 4 years' worth of quiet trust in Brandon Carter to draw on in that room. She had one flagged email that made him look complicit, and one confident, well-spoken colleague standing in front of her, explaining why that was so. She fired Brandon that same afternoon in her office with the door closed in 11 minutes. She did not yell. That was in some ways worse. She spoke to him the way people speak when they've already decided something is finished and are only going through the motions of announcing it. And she used the word liability twice. And she told him the firm would handle severance generously, given the circumstances. And she did not ask him a single question about what actually happened at column 14. Brandon sat across from her with his hands folded in his lap and said almost nothing, because he understood something in that moment that Rachel did not yet understand about herself, that the true story would take real digging to prove, that digging would take months he did not have, and that Halbrong's severance offer, on the table right then, came bundled with a non-disclosure agreement and a lump sum large enough to keep a 6-year-old girl in the same school district, the same bedroom, the same routine for years. He signed it before he left the building. He never once, in the 5 years that followed, told anyone at Halbrook that he'd signed under those terms specifically because of Chloe. He didn't tell his neighbors. He barely let himself think about it directly, because thinking about it directly meant thinking about the fact that a stranger's version of events now lived permanently in his professional file, and that was a thought with no useful bottom to it. Word moved through the firm fast, the way it always does, stripped of nuance by the time it reached the junior staff. Brandon Carter had missed a defect. Brandon Carter had been let go. Colin Ashworth, gracious and visibly shaken in the days that followed, quietly absorbed Brandon's remaining project load and, within 8 months, was promoted into the exact role Brandon had once been informally told he was being groomed for. Nobody at Halbrook, in that first year, ever learned what the real cost of the misjudgment was. Rachel didn't know that the man she'd fired in 11 minutes had gone home that night and told his daughter, in the calm voice he always used with her, that they'd be moving to a smaller apartment and that this was, in its own way, going to be an adventure. Colin didn't know, or didn't let himself know, that his one unlogged decision about rebar specifications had ended a career that had nothing wrong with it. The only person who might have known, a junior structural analyst named Priya Nair, who had overheard Colin on a phone call 2 days before the collapse, promising a supplier he'd handle the paperwork side, said nothing to anyone, because she was 26 years old, 3 months into the job, and terrified. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever been the one holding the real story while somebody more confident got to tell the version that stuck, you're not alone in that. And we'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight, because so many of you carry a version of this same silence. 1 year would pass in near total quiet, and then, almost by accident, on a Tuesday afternoon in a school gymnasium 3 towns away from where any of it had happened, 2 10-year-old girls named Chloe Carter and Madison Collins would be placed on the same recreational soccer roster, and neither of their parents would think twice about it. By the time Chloe turned 10, Brandon had built something small and steady out of what was left. He worked as a facilities technician for a regional property management company, the kind of job that had him crawling through mechanical rooms and inspecting HVAC units in office buildings that, in his old life, he might have designed. It paid enough. It let him leave at 4:30 most days. Nobody in that job knew he'd once carried a PE license and a corner office with his name etched into the door plaque. He'd let the license lapse quietly in year 2, unwilling to spend the money and the emotional cost of maintaining continuing education credits for a credential that felt, most days, like evidence of a life he no longer had access to. What he did have was Chloe, and Chloe's love of soccer, and when the rec league's regular coach dropped out 3 weeks before the fall season, Brandon, who had never coached anything in his life, volunteered mostly because the alternative was watching his daughter's team get folded into a bigger one, and losing the only extracurricular routine she had left. He was, immediately and without trying, good at it. He didn't yell, he noticed things. He could watch a girl's footwork for 4 seconds and tell you exactly which muscle group she was overcompensating with, could tell which kids needed encouragement shouted from the sideline, and which ones needed it said quietly, one-on-one, after practice. Within a month, parents were already coming to each other about how calm he was, how the girls listened to him in a way they hadn't listened to anyone before. Rachel Collins, meanwhile, had spent that same year becoming exactly what the board had once hoped Halbrook's next leader would be. She was CEO now, 18 months into the role, having steered the company through the fallout of the parking structure incident, with a combination of legal caution and reputational discipline that the board privately credited as the reason Halbrook still existed at all. Publicly, the story had been quietly closed, a flagged defect corrected before real harm occurred, an employee let go for a communication failure, a contract salvaged. Privately, Rachel had never fully closed it. She had, in fact, developed a habit she never told anyone about, of pulling Brandon Carter's old personnel file up on her screen late at night. Not out of doubt exactly, more out of a low, persistent hum of something she hadn't examined closely enough to name. The hum got louder the week Colin Ashworth, now Halbrook's director of structural engineering, came to her with a materials substitution request on their newest project. The same supplier, the same category of shortfall, the same confident, reasonable tone he'd used 5 years earlier. She approved it because he was, on paper, exactly the trusted expert she'd elevated him to be. And then, almost involuntarily, she found herself pulling the old Column 14 incident report back up that same night, reading it more carefully than she ever had the first time. That was when she noticed the timestamp discrepancy. Brandon's rebar flag had been sent 6 weeks before the collapse. Colin's resolve notation on the file had been added. She checked twice, 11 days after the incident, not before it. She didn't say anything to anyone yet. She sat with it for 3 days. The way people sit with something they suspect will cost them more the longer they wait to look at it directly. It was Priya Nair, 5 years older now and no longer the terrified new hire, who finally said something. She'd stayed at Halbrook, risen quietly to senior analyst, and had spent 5 years occasionally waking up at 3 a.m., thinking about the phone call she'd overheard and never repeated to anyone. When she heard through the office grapevine that Rachel had been quietly pulling old files, she took a breath she'd been holding for half a decade and asked for 15 minutes of the CEO's time. She told Rachel what she'd overheard. She apologized for the 5 years of silence, her voice shaking, and said the only thing she could say honestly: that she'd been afraid, and that fear had cost an innocent man everything, and she didn't know how to fix 5 years of that, but she wanted to try. Rachel sat very still through the entire conversation, and when it was over, she asked Priya to pull every version of the Column 14 file the server had ever stored, timestamps included. That was the same week Madison Collins came home from her first soccer practice, talking about her new coach, a quiet man who'd shown her how to strike a ball with the inside of her foot instead of her toe, and Rachel, distracted, only half listening the way parents sometimes are after a long day, told her that sounded great, sweetheart, and didn't think about it again until 4 Saturdays later when she finally made it to a game in person and saw his face across the field. A secondary crisis landed the same week, one Rachel hadn't planned for. A structural inspector on Halbrook's current project flagged an anomaly eerily similar to Column 14, a stress pattern nobody could immediately explain, on a deadline the board was already anxious about, with Colin Ashworth once again the only senior engineer positioned to sign off on it. Rachel now had 2 unresolved threads pulling at her at once, a live structural risk in front of her, and a 5-year-old injustice she was only beginning to understand. And for the first time in her career, she genuinely did not know which one to address first. She approached Brandon at the edge of that soccer field with a folding chair under her arm and old guilt in her chest, and she asked him, quietly, if they could talk after practice. He agreed. He didn't ask why. He'd learned a long time ago not to expect explanations to arrive on his timeline. 2 weeks would pass before either of them said the words Column 14 out loud to each other, and by the time they did, the anomaly on Halbrook's newest project would already be forcing its way toward the surface, whether anyone was ready for it or not. They met at a diner near the school, a neutral place neither of them had any history with, and Rachel arrived first and ordered coffee she didn't drink. When Brandon sat down across from her, she didn't waste time on pleasantries. She told him, plainly, what she'd found, the timestamp discrepancy, Priya's confession, the years of quiet doubt she'd never acted on, until a materials substitution request forced her to look again. She told him Halbrook would reinstate him immediately if he wanted it, at whatever title he wanted, with back pay calculated from the day he'd been let go. And she told him she was sorry, in a voice that cracked slightly on the word, in a way her board had never once heard from her. Brandon listened to all of it without interrupting, the same stillness he brought to every sideline conversation with a nervous 10-year-old. When she finished, he didn't ask for the money, and he didn't ask for the title. He asked her one question instead, whether Halbrook's current project, the one with the new anomaly, still had the original design specs on file, and whether he could look at them. She hadn't expected that. She agreed anyway. What followed over the next 10 days was the closest thing to a reveal that either of them would get, and it happened almost entirely in silence, in a windowless records room where Brandon sat with printouts spread across a folding table, cross-referencing 5-year-old load calculations against a current structural anomaly that Halbrook's newest hires, all credentialed, all confident, all trained on software Brandon had never even opened, could not explain. It took him 6 hours to find it. The new project's anomaly wasn't new at all. It was the same supplier substitution pattern from column 14, applied again, on a different structure, by the same director who'd approved it the first time, because Colin Ashworth had never actually corrected his sourcing process. He had simply gotten better, in 5 years, at making sure nobody looked closely enough to notice. Brandon wrote up his findings the way he always had, in clean, unemotional, fully cited technical language, no accusation in a single sentence, only numbers that could not be argued with. He handed the report to Rachel, without a word of commentary about what it meant for Colin's career. Rachel brought it to the board herself. What unraveled after that unraveled quickly, in the specific bloodless way corporate failures usually do. Colin was placed on administrative leave within 48 hours, pending a full audit of every project he'd signed off on in the past 6 years. The audit, once it started, kept finding more, smaller substitutions on smaller projects, each one defensible in isolation, each one, in aggregate, painting a picture of a man who had spent half a decade quietly cutting corners and quietly letting other people absorb the consequences when the corners showed. He didn't fight it publicly. Men like Colin rarely do. The same instinct for reading a room that had carried him upward for years told him, the moment the board's tone shifted, that this particular room had already decided, and there was nothing charming enough left to say. There's an old, familiar argument that always resurfaces in stories like this one, and it's worth sitting with honestly rather than rushing past. Whether someone who watches a wrong happen and stays quiet out of fear is meaningfully different from the person who committed the wrong in the first place, or whether silence, however understandable, still has its own cost that someone eventually has to pay. Priya Nair would have told you, if you'd asked her that week, that she didn't think there was an easy answer. She just knew she wasn't going to be quiet again. Rachel, meanwhile, was carrying a different weight entirely. She had built the last 5 years of her career, in part, on a decision she now understood had been wrong, made under pressure, defended afterward by her own unwillingness to look too closely at a settled story. She had a board to answer to, a reputation to manage, and a genuine, gnawing guilt that had nothing to do with optics and everything to do with the 11 minutes she'd once spent firing a man who'd never once been given the chance to explain himself. She would have to decide, soon, whether to fix this quietly, behind closed doors, the way the company had handled everything 5 years earlier, or whether to do something that would cost her, publicly, in front of the very board that had only just started fully trusting her. 3 weeks later, at Halbrook's quarterly all-company meeting, with 200 employees in the room and the board seated in the front row, Rachel Collins would stand up and make her choice in front of every single one of them. She didn't have to do it that way. Her legal team had drafted a quiet settlement, a private reinstatement, a clean, low-visibility way to correct the record without ever having to say, out loud, in front of the people who'd trusted her decision 5 years earlier, that she had gotten it wrong. Rachel read that draft twice, then set it aside, and asked her assistant to add 15 minutes to the agenda of the next all-company meeting. She stood in front of 200 employees and the full board and told them, without softening it, that 5 years earlier, Halbrook had fired an innocent man to protect a deadline and a reputation, that she had made that call herself, and that the company was correcting it now, fully and on the record, because a correction made quietly wasn't really a correction at all. It was just a smaller version of the same silence. She read Brandon Carter's name into the minutes. She said, plainly, that his original engineering flag had been accurate, that the failure to act on it belonged to Colin Ashworth, and to the leadership, herself included, who hadn't questioned him hard enough. Somewhere in the third row, Priya Nair sat with her hands pressed flat against her knees, listening to a truth she'd helped surface finally being said out loud where it could never be quietly filed away again. Afterward, the company offered Brandon everything a redemption story is supposed to want. His old title back, a seat one level above where he'd left, a public statement crediting him by name in every trade publication that had once run a quiet paragraph about his dismissal. He turned almost all of it down. He didn't want the corner office. He told Rachel in the same still, unhurried voice he used with a 10-year-old who just missed a penalty kick, that he didn't need Halbrook to tell him what he already knew about his own work. What he asked for instead was smaller and in its way much larger, a formal review process written into company policy, requiring that any safety flag from a licensed engineer be independently verified before a project could proceed, regardless of who raised it or how confidently someone else claimed it had been resolved. He asked that the process be named, plainly, after the incident that had created it, so no future employee working late in an empty parking structure would ever again have their word weighed against someone else's charm. The board approved it unanimously within a week. Months passed the way ordinary months do, without headlines. Brandon didn't quit his facilities job right away. He kept it for a while longer, partly out of habit, partly because Chloe's routine mattered more to him than anyone's timeline for his comeback. He did, eventually, renew his engineering license, and he did, eventually, take a senior advisory role at Halbrook, part-time, structured around soccer practice and school pickup, because some routines were never up for negotiation. On a cool Saturday morning the following spring, Rachel Collins sat in a folding chair at the edge of the same field where all of this had restarted, watching Madison and Chloe run a passing drill together, laughing at something neither of the adults could hear. Brandon walked over during a water break, and for a moment neither of them said anything about Halbrook, or Column 14, or boardrooms at all. Rachel finally asked him, quietly, whether he ever regretted staying silent for so long, taking the settlement, never fighting it in public. He thought about it, the way he thought about everything, without rushing, and said that he hadn't been protecting his pride back then. He'd been protecting one person who needed a stable roof over her head more than he'd needed to be believed. Rachel nodded, and didn't ask anything else, because she understood, maybe for the first time, that some kinds of worth were never going to announce themselves loudly, and that the people who carried the most of it were often the last ones in the room to say so. If you've ever known someone like that, someone quietly good at what they did, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate until the moment the truth finally caught up to them, we'd love for you to tell us about them in the comments tonight, even if it's just to finally give them, in writing, the credit they never got to hear out loud. Sometimes that's the only ceremony a story like this ever gets, and it still counts. And if you believe the way we do that quiet, overlooked people deserve to be seen eventually, even if it takes years, even if it takes a soccer field and a folding chair and a coincidence nobody planned, consider staying part of our story here and subscribing, because we've got more of these overlooked heroes waiting to be told, and we'd genuinely love to have you with us for the next one. Somewhere out there tonight, someone is doing quiet, careful work that nobody around them has bothered to notice yet. Stay a little longer with us, because the next story might just be about someone you know.